Well, I was thinking about some of the things that we've been learning through this pandemic, and I realized that there are a whole bunch of new words that we now know that we really had no idea what they were just a couple of months ago. For example, back in January, if I said to you, I think I'm going to practice some social distancing, you would have looked at me like, what are you talking about, right? No clue what that meant. But now, if I said to you, hey, you really should continue practicing social distancing because you might be an asymptomatic carrier. And even though we've pretty effectively flattened the curve, there are still some hospitals who are short on ventilators and PPE. And so, we should listen to the advice of the leading epidemiologists as they investigate potential treatments like hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, as they develop the needed antibody testing and contact tracing. So I would say that even if you haven't received your PPP for your business or your stimulus check, you should probably continue to shelter in place and, if necessary, self-quarantine. You just understood everything I just said, didn't you? Or almost everything I said. It is amazing that we have become fluent in an entirely new language in about 2 months. We've learned so much. But here's what I keep wondering. Besides all the fancy new words that we now know, are we really learning anything at all? So we've been doing this series for 6 weeks. It's a 6-week series called Lockdown Lessons, things that God is trying to teach us through this pandemic that we might not learn any other time. And I'm just convinced that one of the things that we need to learn is to love our neighbor. I'm seeing evidence that this situation can affect us in one of two very different ways. We can become actually more turned inward, oblivious to the needs around us, or we can become more attuned to and more focused on the needs of other people. Totally different results depending on the way that we respond. And so today's lockdown lesson is love your neighbor. So look with me at the passage for today. We're in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. Hear the word of the Lord. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. This is the word of God. So before I lay out the points, let me set this up a little bit. Jesus is approached by an expert in the law. So this is a guy who knew the Hebrew scriptures really well. And he asks Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answers that question by asking another question, which was a very rabbinical thing for Jesus to do. He says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? Because this was a guy who knew the scriptures. And the guy says, well, love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. So he quotes 2 Old Testament commands, one from Leviticus and one from Deuteronomy. And Jesus says, good answer. Do this and you will live. Now, if this guy had some decent self-knowledge, he might have stopped and said, wait, do this? Like I have to love God with all that I have and consistently love my neighbor as much as I love myself? That's a high standard. I don't know if I can really do that well at that. Jesus, could you help me out? I think if the guy had responded somehow like that, this conversation might have gone in a very different direction. But he didn't say that. Instead, it says he wanted to justify himself. Man, this guy is so much like us. And so he asks Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Like, I'm pretty sure I'm good here, but before I go away, could you just clarify what you mean by neighbor? He's hoping that Jesus would say, well, I just mean your family and your close friends and the people who attend the same synagogue as you. In which case, the guy would have said, that's what I thought. I'm good. Yeah, I love those people. But Jesus didn't say that. And this guy had no idea what he was getting himself into. So, as he often did, Jesus tells a story. And in this story, we learn 4 things about what it really means to love our neighbor. So let's talk today about seeing your neighbor, avoiding your neighbor, loving your neighbor, and then the ultimate neighbor. All right? Seeing your neighbor, avoiding your neighbor, loving your neighbor, and the ultimate neighbor. So first, seeing your neighbor. So in this story that Jesus tells, there's a guy traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's about a 17-mile journey on a very steep and windy road. All along that road, there are little caves, which were perfect places for bandits to hide out. In fact, the first century historian Josephus wrote that people who traveled that road often took weapons with them to protect themselves. So this would be sort of like walking through South Central LA or inner city Detroit at night. And sure enough, the man was attacked and stripped and robbed and beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. So let's just step back for a minute. The man asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story about a guy who gets beat up and left by the side of the road. Why would he do that? Well, it must be because you and I are surrounded by wounded and beaten and bloodied people. So if we want to understand what Jesus means by loving our neighbor, we have to understand that this man in the story lying by the side of the road represents people in our lives. So what might that look like in our world, especially at a time like this? I would say that sometimes it's pretty obvious, like the guy bleeding on the road. Right now, there are people hooked up to ventilators fighting for their lives, and Jesus says, that's your neighbor. There are the families of those people praying desperately for the survival of their grandmother or grandfather or father or mother or increasingly for their child. And Jesus says those people worried about the health of their family members, those are your neighbors. There are owners of hair salons and other small businesses who are having a hard time making ends meet, wondering if their business is going to survive. And Jesus says those are your neighbors. I believe that God is using this situation to connect us with people like that we may have never in any other way gotten to know. But those are our neighbors. God is connecting us with them. Sometimes, though, the pain that people carry is not so obvious. There are people who are struggling with mental illness and addiction, and now they feel more isolated in their pain than ever before. You know, social distancing might be good for them hygienically, but it's not good for their psychological well-being. They're struggling. Those are our neighbors. What about nursing homes and assisted care facilities? Behind those fountains and manicured gardens, there's this crushing problem called loneliness. It's getting worse. You know, even before the pandemic started, as our society becomes more busy and more wealthy and more technologically advanced, we become more isolated. And the coronavirus pandemic is just exacerbating it. And Jesus says, those people behind those walls are your neighbors. Some of the victims on the road aren't so obvious, but believe me, they're there. And so in order to love them, we need to see them. And so maybe the first step for you is just to pray this simple prayer. Lord, would you help me to see the people that I've been missing? The victims who are bloodied by the side of the road that normally I don't even see. Open my eyes and help me to see them. That's the first step. But seeing is not enough because it's possible to see but choose not to act. And so let's talk about avoiding your neighbor. Jesus continues the story, verse 31. A priest happened to be going down the same road. I'm sure when they heard that, the people thought, oh, good. Of all the people who could happen by, it's a guy who does good deeds for a living. But then it says, first surprise, in a story that's full of surprises, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Well, that's weird. He must have had a reason, right? But here comes someone else. So too, a Levite. Levites were people from the tribe of Levi who would assist the priests in their work that they did in the temple. So surely this guy will stop. When he came to the place and saw him, he too passed by on the other side. What's going on here? I mean, did this priest and this Levite think, hey, this is a setup? Like if they stop to help, they're going to get jumped too, maybe? Were they afraid that they might become ceremonially unclean? There were these laws in the Old Testament that said that if you were someone who worked in the temple and you touched a sick body or a dead body, you could become, ceremonially unclean so that you couldn't perform your work in the temple anymore. Maybe they were worried about that. Or were they maybe just busy and they didn't have time or felt they didn't have time to stop? I don't know. Back in the 1970s, Princeton Seminary conducted a study. They took a group of theology students and they told them they needed to go to a building on the other side of the campus and give a sermon about the Good Samaritan. But they had to hurry because they didn't have much time. What these students didn't realize was that the researchers had also hired an actor to play the part of a beaten up, desperate person right along the path asking for help. So this was the perfect setup, right? So what happened? Here's what happened. 90% of the students completely ignored the suffering student. In fact, the study said this, quote, indeed, on several occasions, a seminary student going to give his talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan literally stepped over the victim as he hurried on his way. How pathetic is that, right? But you know what? It's so easy for us to judge. Don't we have our ways of avoiding as well? Don't we have our ways of seeing but kind of choosing not to see? Why do we do that? Well, I can think of a few reasons. I think a big one, honestly, is self-righteousness. I mean, be honest with yourself. When you see struggling people, isn't there sometimes a voice in you that says, well, they're kind of getting what they deserve. They were irresponsible. And so why would I help them? They'll never learn anything. And yet what we don't realize is that we could easily be in their position. Listen to what the sociologist Brené Brown said about this. We are those people. The truth is, we are the others. Most of us are one paycheck, one divorce, one drug-addicted kid, one mental health diagnosis, one serious illness, one sexual assault, one drinking binge, one night of unprotected sex, or one affair away from being those people. The ones we don't trust, the ones we pity, the ones we don't let our children play with, the ones that bad things happen to. I wonder if that priest and that Levite felt just a little too good for that guy on the road. I think sometimes that's what stops us from helping. Self-righteousness. Another reason is busyness. We're so fixed on our agenda, we run with such tight schedules that sometimes we think, man, I can't stop and pay attention to this person because I'll never get all the stuff on my list done. I'm just too busy for it. I think a related reason is messiness. You know, we look at someone and their problems and we think, man, if I get involved in this person's life, it's just going to be like stepping into a quagmire. I'll never get out of it. I mean, I probably won't be able to fix them anyway. And what we don't realize is that God doesn't ask us to fix anyone. That's his job. He just asks us to love them. So we have our reasons for avoiding. The question is, how do we push past that? How do we become people who actually do what Jesus is teaching and love our neighbors as ourselves? Let's talk about that, loving your neighbor. Verse 33 says, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. What does this tell us about loving our neighbor? I think there are two big things we're supposed to see here. First, it's a kind of love that is non-discriminating. Non-discriminating. This is the biggest surprise in the passage, that Jesus makes the hero of the story a Samaritan. It's hard for us to realize the effect it would have had on Jesus' Jewish listeners when they heard him say that word. Because when we hear a Samaritan, what do we think? We immediately think, oh, a good Samaritan, that's a good guy, right? Not to a Jewish person in the first century. There was such an animosity between those two ethnicities. Samaritans were people who had some Jewish blood in their veins, but it was mixed with pagan or with Gentile blood, and so they were considered mixed breeds. There was a deep suspicion, there was a deep prejudice, lack of trust. There was a hatred between those groups of people. I think it's hard for us to find a modern day equivalent, and maybe today, because our country is so politically divided, it would be something like this. If you are a very conservative person, how do you feel about that lesbian woman in your office? The one who sometimes you see wearing that Planned Parenthood t-shirt, who gets all her news from CNN and NPR? I'm not asking if you agree with her. I'm asking, how do you feel about her as a human being? Maybe that's your Samaritan. Or if you're a much more progressive, liberal person, how do you feel about that guy with the NRA bumper sticker on the back of his truck, who sometimes walks around in that red and white Make America Great Again hat, who insists that anything other than Fox News is fake news? I'm not asking if you agree with him. I'm asking, how do you feel about him as a human being? Maybe that's your Samaritan. See, what Jesus is calling us to here is getting to know people and caring about people and entering into the lives of people that are very different from us. I think we're going to need some supernatural help to do this, don't you? So it's a love that's non-discriminating. Here's the other big thing we're supposed to see. This kind of love is sacrificial. It's not just emotions or words. Think about all the Samaritan man gave up. He gave up his time, right? He was headed somewhere that day, and yet he gave up his time so he could pay attention to this man. He gave up his own oil, his own wine to treat this guy's wounds. He took the guy and put him over the back of his own donkey. That must have been a mess. He took the guy to an inn. He stayed overnight with him. He cared for him overnight. The next day, he paid for that night in the inn with his own money. Even though he had to go on his way, he made arrangements for the guy to be taken care of. He promised he would come back and check on the guy. Think of the investment to check on the guy and to pay whatever other fees had been accrued. In other words, the love that Jesus is teaching is sacrificial. It wasn't a Facebook like. It wasn't signing an online petition. It costs us time and convenience and money. So the kind of love that Jesus is talking about is non-discriminating, which is amazing in itself. It's sacrificial. So what might that look like for us at a time like this? Let me just give you a few examples from just the past couple of months right around here. Some of our neighbors who are struggling the most in this situation are the poor, the homeless, those living in inner cities. So shortly after the pandemic started, we contacted our friends at Star of Hope Ministries in Patterson and our friends at Salvation Army in Montclair, and we just asked them, hey, how can we help? And they both said there's an urgent need for food for the people that they serve. So we started immediately collecting food on the porch of our Lincoln Park campus. At first, it was kind of slow. I think people were afraid to, leave their germs on food packages, so, not much happened. And then after a couple of weeks, the momentum started to pick up, and we really started to see the bins fill up. And now there's a whole bunch of people, every time they go to the grocery store, they just buy extra stuff, they bring it, they donate it here. We keep on emptying those bins. As of today, we have now given 2 full truckloads to Star of Hope in Patterson, 2 full truckloads to Salvation Army in Montclair, and it's still coming in. Those are our neighbors, and that's some of what it means to love them. In addition to our normal food pantry, which continues to provide weekly food for about 50 families, we have developed in the last 2 months this brand new ministry called Chapel Care Delivers. So listen to this. We have 42 volunteer drivers who deliver groceries and run errands for people who have a hard time getting out. We have partnered now with Rails Steakhouse in Towacco. So this is a picture of Jamie Longo, our director of care, with 2 chapel people, Sarah and Sue, and they're standing there with the head chef of Rails. So the way it happened was Rails contacted us, and they said, hey, we would like to start donating meals to people who are struggling in our community. So Chapel, could you help us identify the families, and could you deliver the meals to us? And so as of today, Rails has donated over 250 meals, and the Chapel has had the privilege of driving them, delivering them to families who have kids with special needs, families with frontline healthcare workers, families who have elderly members that can't get out. It has just been tremendous. And now, in addition, the Red Barn restaurant, which is also in Tawako, has gotten in on the action. They donated 100 meals to families on Mother's Day, which we were able to deliver for them. Do you realize how remarkable this is? The restaurants are struggling. These are not good times for restaurants, and yet they are choosing to invest in their community, to do the sacrificial thing. It is a privilege to partner with them through this. These are our neighbors. You probably know that the Chapel does a lot of work in Bogota, Colombia, helping to build churches. And so this last week we did a little research, and we found out that the situation in Bogota is really serious. The government was very quick to shut things down, which has been good health-wise, but it's really hurt the poor of the community. And so we began to find out that there are homes all over Bogota that are flying red flags out their windows as a sign of desperation, showing that they're starving and they need help because it's so difficult to get out and it's so difficult to find food. And so just a couple of days ago, we spent some time on the phone with some of the pastors that we partner with in Colombia. I wound up talking with a guy named Alex Rodriguez, one of our partner pastors, not the Alex Rodriguez that you think, but the guy who leads this street ministry in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Colombia. So actually, this is a picture of me with Alex and his mother last fall. And so I talked to Alex and I said, hey, how are things going? And I said, we've heard about these families that are flying red flags out their windows. Are you seeing that in your neighborhood? And he said, every street, we see them. But he said they're not flags because these people can't afford flags. They're rags, red rags that get flown out the window. The people are desperate. And they're doing their best feeding. They have about 1,500 immigrant kids, or 1,500 kids from the street that they feed. They have about 250 of them are Venezuelan immigrants. In fact, we have a picture of our folks last fall ministering to them and serving and feeding some of these kids. But he said, the need far outstrips our ability to help. And so we realized that the Chapel this last fall took a large donation to help build churches in Bogota. And then we started to think, man, what's the use of building churches when people are starving? And so we took a big chunk of those funds. We sent them down to Pastor Alex. They're overjoyed. They're going to be able to minister to hundreds and hundreds of more families. Guys, even though that's thousands of miles away, those are our neighbors. A little bit closer to home, there is a barber whose shop is right in town, and it's actually right next door to the shop of a person from the Chapel. This is a barber who cuts the hair of a bunch of different Chapel people, including my hair. And so when the government shut down his shop, it started to get really urgent and critical for him pretty quickly. And so a few of us got together and we decided to dig deep and take a collection and so we could provide for this guy and his family during this crisis. I had the joy of going over to his house and delivering to him a big envelope full of cash and ShopRite gift cards. This guy's not a Christian, and he was just amazed that we would do this for him, that he was considered our neighbor. If you think of all of those examples, in every one of those circumstances, people could have seen the needs and found a reason to avoid it, right? I mean, the government can help those people. It's not my problem. I've got my own things to take care of. It would have been so easy to go to the other side of the road and avoid the need. But in every one of those cases, the Christ-like thing was done. The beautiful thing was done. The decision was made to love our neighbors. And it's just so great to hear those stories. So the question is, how do we become this kind of people regularly? How do we consistently love our neighbors? Well, let's talk about this last point, the ultimate neighbor. When he's done telling the parable, Jesus asks a question. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers. The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So what do you think that expert in the law was thinking as he walked away? Because it doesn't say. Hopefully he was thinking two things, and I hope these are the same two things that we're thinking. First, we should feel challenged because Jesus has just told us what it truly means to love our neighbor. So we should be thinking, people are so precious, people are so important, even people that are really different than me, and I need to see their pain and move toward them. I need to be willing to sacrifice myself for them. So I'm going to open up my eyes during the lockdown. I'm going to keep my eyes open even after this lockdown. I'm going to be this kind of person. So this teaching should challenge us, right? But at the same time, we should also feel a little bit exposed. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves, because we will admit that we fall far short of this so many times, right? I mean, I'll just speak for myself. So many times I see, but I don't see. I avoid eye contact. I find a way to cross over to the other side of the road. And so if we're really honest, we will kind of confess, this doesn't come that naturally to me. I'm not that good at this. So if we're honest enough to kind of own that, what should we do about that? Well, we should stop trying to justify ourselves like the guy in the story did and just kind of look up and say, help. And when we do that, when we look to God and we listen to his voice, especially in teachings like this, here's what we're going to see. That in a very unexpected way, the hero of this story is not the Samaritan guy. The hero of the story is Jesus. That the ultimate Good Samaritan is actually Jesus. Think about it. Jesus saw you beaten up and bloody by the side of the road. I mean, spiritually speaking, that's the condition that all of us have found ourselves in. Because of our own sin, because of the ways we've been sinned against by other people, we are kind of a wreck. And at infinite cost to himself, Jesus picked us up and nursed us back to health. Think about it. Jesus didn't just give up his oil and his wine like the guy in the story did. He gave up his very life on the cross so that you and I could be forgiven and reconciled with our Creator, truly healed. Have you received his healing personally? It's something that can only be done by faith, just looking to him and saying, yes, I receive the healing that you've given for me. See, Jesus is the ultimate Good Samaritan. Jesus is the ultimate healer. He is really the hero of the story. And so the only way for us to consistently be this kind of person and love our neighbor is to first allow ourselves to be loved by Jesus. It says in the book of 1 John, we love only because he first loved us. And so the secret to this, to being the kind of person that Jesus is talking about here, is to walk through our days every day, recognizing we don't have it in ourselves, but looking to God in a sense of dependence, receiving the love of Jesus and giving it out to other people. I mean, every day, being a wounded healer, realizing I desperately need his love, I receive it, and now I've got more to give out. Receiving the love of Jesus and giving it out to other people. That's the way to live. Let me just share one more story with you today. There's a woman from the chapel named Barb who works at a local college. And there's a student at the college, a young woman, who has lost both her grandmother and her mother to COVID-19. And so the people who work in Barb's department at the college decided to take a little collection, and they gathered about $150 to buy this student a ShopRite gift card to help her family during this time. So Barb brought the money home, and she gave it to her husband so he could go to ShopRite, he could buy the gift card. Well, that's when the trouble started, because on the way to ShopRite, he lost the money. And I don't know why, I couldn't help thinking of It's a Wonderful Life with Uncle Billy who loses the money on the way to the bank, but anyway, some of you will get that. So her husband lost the money, he couldn't believe it, he came back home, he told his wife, I lost the money. So Barb went on Facebook immediately, and so she told all of her neighbors to be alert and look for this bag of money somewhere between their home and ShopRite. Within minutes, her phone started ringing. friends and people from all over the community started ringing her doorbell, leaving money and gift cards on her porch, in her mailbox, asking for her Venmo information so they could get money to her. All of these people wanting to help this 19-year-old stranger because they realized that she was their neighbor. Within a couple of hours, that $150 had become $800. And it gets better. Shortly afterwards, in the parking lot of ShopRite, guess what somebody found? A Ziploc bag with $150 in cash in it. It was turned into the courtesy desk. That was added to the total. And so what was going to be this cute little gift card of $150 wound up being almost $1,000 of help to help this girl get through this crisis. Isn't that an awesome thing? It almost seems like God was so pleased with their desire to love their neighbor that he entered into it and supernaturally multiplied it in a way that they could never have imagined. Awesome. And stories like that just keep on rolling in. So how about you? I mean, this lockdown is not going to last forever, right? Within a couple weeks, it looks like some of the restrictions are going to be loosened, and probably within a few months, it'll feel a lot more back to normal. There will be some people who re-enter regular life just as self-absorbed, just as oblivious to the needs around them as they ever were, maybe even more, but not you. You're going to walk out of this more alert, more attuned to the needs of the people around you, more willing to give yourself sacrificially, to take risks to serve the needs of others. And it's going to change you not just right after the lockdown, it's going to change the way you live for the rest of your life because you have taken the time during this lockdown to learn to love your neighbor. I just can't wait to see that happen. Would you rise as we close our service today? As we close today, I want to pray and ask that we hear the words of Jesus that he spoke today, just like that man did, as if they were spoken directly to us, because they were. Let's pray together. Father, we confess that sometimes we walk right by. We see, but then we choose to look away. But today, Lord, I pray that you would so grip us with the love that Christ has had for us, that we would be so aware, Lord, of how much we have been loved, that we would freshly receive your love today, and that would so energize us, Lord, that we would go out with our eyes wide open. Lord, I know that there are people listening to my voice who are connected with people who are really struggling financially, struggling emotionally, struggling in so many ways. And I pray, Father, that you would so fill us with your love today that we would go out and that we would care, that we would truly love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Lord, would you just unleash a blessing in this community through us? We can't wait to be used by you. In Jesus' powerful name, amen.